hand, and then we'll address those, as Tom goes along. Because we do have a large crowd, I know it's tempting to keep adding a question on to a question to a question as Tom answers, but if you can try to limit yourself to just one question at a time, we want to try to give everybody a chance to interact and ask questions as we go. And with that, I'll hand it over to Tom.
Thank you so much, Samantha. And thank you, Lori, and everyone at the center for hosting me. I hope to come visit in person one day. But I'm a big fan of this speaker series, so I'm very honored and happy to get to participate in it in this way. I've been attending many other sessions, and I'm signed up for, I think, pretty much every session for the remainder of the series this year. So thanks again so much. It's a great honor to get to chat with you all today, and I will try to save. I tend to talk too much, but I'll try to save plenty of time for question and answer, both from the room and from folks on Zoom. So, practical wisdom for evaluators. As you may have seen in the abstract or the summary of this session, this chat today centers in large part around this book, Practical Wisdom for an Ethical Evaluation Practice, that I co-edited with Martha Hurteau, and this just came out last year. Here's the table of contents. I highly recommend the book, not just because I contributed to it, but I think it's a very salient and timely topic, and I'd love to get some of your thoughts on this topic as we progress today. As you can see, it's divided up into 3 overarching sections: what practical wisdom is and sort of where the current thinking is on it. Then a series of chapters focusing on the person of the evaluator being wise and what that looks like in different contexts. And then a couple chapters at the end on how to develop it. I will say, actually, there's going to be a review of the book coming out in the Canadian Journal of Program Evaluation, and I've gotten a sneak peek at it, and it's an excellent summary as well as critical friend perspective, pulling out some of the tensions and kind of debates even internally within the different chapters of the book, because I don't think we set out to put down the once and for all statement on what practical wisdom is and what it means for evaluation. It's a conversation amongst peers. I will say also that it has a largely sort of Euro-American epistemology and framing throughout, which is perhaps one of its limitations. We are very happy that we have one chapter from my dear friend Moka Pahana, who's on the call today. Thanks for joining, representing some perspectives from South Africa. I will also say that some dear relatives were hoping to write from an Indigenous evaluation perspective, but unfortunately that was not commensurate with the publisher, which is a topic we've talked about elsewhere in I think even earlier sessions of this speaker series. So those of you who are working on publishing, involved in publishing, it is coming to a head where notions of copyright allowances and whose knowledge is represented in books and in journals is very salient in evaluation. And in this case, we experienced what could be called by feminist epistemologists epistemic violence, a silencing of certain voices due to structural procedures around publishing. So that is a sad point about this book, but I thought it was important to note as well. But the contributions that are here are very robust and helpful, even if incomplete. So what is practical wisdom? I'm sure you have a sense. It's also one of those things, one of those terms that is really hard to define. And even throughout the book, people, our authors more aptly sort of describe it rather than define it. So I don't know if these count as definitions or descriptions. But in any case, Ernie House, writing in the book, and I will say a bit more about Ernie House. He has been thinking and talking about practical wisdom for quite a while. And so he describes it as doing the right thing in the special circumstances of performing the job being whatever particular professional endeavor you find yourself facing. Tom Schwandt, also writing in the book, also someone who's written about this sometimes by other names, but going back many decades. It's really been a mainstay of a lot of his philosophy of evaluation. So we're very glad to have him contributing to the book as well. And he describes it as being about knowing what is right, good, or best to do in a particular set of circumstances. Very circular with evaluation, because how are we to know what is good or best? Those are evaluative words themselves. So there's kind of a cycle there that's being set up. Tom Schwandt also goes on to describe it as pragmatic, context-dependent, involving deliberating on a course of action based on principles and values informed by critical reflection. And in his chapter, he goes on to so one of the most common popular press notions of practical wisdom is from Sharp, who describes it as essentially doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons. And very good approach, but Tom suggests that that's a little bit limited and limiting because it's sort of one way of approaching phronesis, which we'll talk about in a moment. Oftentimes, practical wisdom is, or rather, phronesis, which is one of the Aristotelian virtues, intellectual virtues, is translated as practical wisdom. I'll circle back around to that in just a moment. But Schwandt would like us to expand out to incorporate analytical reasoning, practical reasoning, deliberation, reflection, and praxis. So all of those are complicated and good things in and of themselves. And he suggests that together they constitute what could be called practical wisdom. Great. So, I thought it might be salient to share just a few thoughts on how I got even interested in this topic and how I came to have the honor of co-editing this volume. My home discipline, if you will, is, or one of them, is adult education. So I had the joy and honor of working with Arthur Butch Wilson at Cornell. He was my advisor. Very sadly, he passed away a few years ago. And he, interestingly, he really did not do anything at all with evaluation. But in the context of adult education, he was very focused on the role of power. And so that is one thing I carry with me. Here's two of his books there with his longtime colleague from University of Georgia, Ron Severo, around program planning, and particularly the role of power in program planning. But throughout all of that, he was very interested in and concerned with professionalization. So in his case, professionalization of adult education. And in doing so, informed by his very well-attuned power analysis, he was constantly reminding us and constantly writing about the nuances of praxis and how so often professionalization is a flattening and compressing process that does not reflect and do justice to the richness of professional practice in contexts. Around the same time, I had the amazing opportunity to take a participatory action research class with David Greenwood, who you see there on the top. And he introduced me to the book you see below there, which is by Brent Fluberg, Making Social Science Matter. And this is where I first encountered the notion of phronesis. So you can't quite see it in the image, but that text is about what Fluberg calls phronetic social science. Not frenetic like frantic, although we often feel that way when we're doing social science, but phronetic, phronetic. And so phronetic social science, Fluberg proposed, and then we sort of used this as one of the organizing principles in the class on participatory action research to rethink the role of social science inquiry in the world, and to admit back into the conversation more explicitly values and a desire to do the right thing through the social inquiry. Interestingly, values, of course, bring us back around to evaluation. Emily Gates and Tom Schwandt have done some wonderful writing on values and valuing in social science that pertains to this as well. So phronetic social science, making social science matter. And then, as I mentioned, in evaluation, along with Tom Schwandt, Ernie House has long been discussing this. And so this handy little book here, Evaluating Values, Biases, and Practical Wisdom, if you have not read it, I highly, highly recommend it. It's Ernie is such a good writer. He uses narrative and stories and clear, compelling cases. And it's a short book packed with lots of wisdom, no pun intended. As if any of you have spent 5 minutes with me before, you know I like talking about evaluative thinking. So this is this sort of my trajectory of understanding power, understanding the need to push back against technical rationality, and then I learned about action research well before I learned about evaluation. And so that was a sort of ethos that I had about how to think about inquiry in the world, research in the world. Then when I learned about evaluation, especially through my work in evaluation capacity building, which is really, I kind of learned how to do ECB even before I learned how to do evaluation, which is ironic. But from that perspective, trying to help non-evaluators get better at doing and using evaluation, I came to focus a lot with my colleagues, Jane Buckley and others, on evaluative thinking. And this was my way of bringing my background in adult education and action research and participatory community development into evaluation, aligning it also with the logic of evaluation, or those core elements of the definition of evaluation, like from Scriven, for instance, on merit, worth, significance. So the evaluative thinking would be a whole different talk. We can talk about that some other time. But this was one way for me throughout the years of continuously sort of juxtaposing notions of phronesis without really laying it all out there. And then at the Canadian Evaluation Society, I met Martha Hurteau, whose work I had long admired, particularly her work on intuition in evaluation, which I'll share with you in just a little while, and then also on the ever elusive synthesis step in the logic of evaluation. So both of which relate to practical wisdom. So she was presenting at CES, and I expressed my interest in that work, and then later that led to us producing this book. Also, going back to my education in adult education, my enculturation in adult education. Adult education places a very high premium on reflection and reflective practice. So Tiffany Tovey, who's here today, hi Tiffany, and our chapter in the book is a look at we attempted with some success, some moderate success, to unpack and understand the nature of the relationship between reflective practice, evaluative thinking, and practical wisdom. Earlier, with Leah Neubauer and others, I had and actually with Stephen Brookfield, who is one of my adult education heroes as well. He actually, a lot of our work on evaluative thinking we stole from him and just with his permission and applied it to evaluation, because he does a lot of work on critical thinking, and while evaluative thinking is different, that's another conversation for another time, and one on which I do not have clear answers yet, per se, maybe never will. He has a lot of exercises and activities and things to facilitate with people that are very well suited for promoting evaluative thinking. In doing that writing with Leah Neubauer and Stephen Brookfield, we came across this, we sort of proposed this framework for understanding reflective practice in evaluation. There's many others, and again, Tiffany Tovey is one of the leading thinkers on this area. But it occurred to us that, an evaluator can reflect on at least 4 levels: the macro, meso, micro, and meta. And while we were not talking about practical wisdom at the time of writing this piece, it very clearly connects. In part because if you look at the macro level, all of our guiding principles, all of our standards for evaluation push us towards working towards the common good. So that is, there's an ethical consideration there. Sometimes some people question, if they feel that evaluation is getting too activist-like, sometimes they push back. But you cannot do good evaluation according to the guiding principles and whatnot if you are not working towards the common good. That's at the macro level. Then at the meso level, and this is very much Laurie Sivan, Jean King, etc., evaluators ought to constantly be reflecting on their own competencies and using self-awareness to improve their practice. Then on the micro level, when you are in a room with a client, when you are looking at a survey, when you are conducting a focus group with teenagers, you are using micro-reflection all the time to make small adjustments to your practice. And then there's times like today where we meta-reflect. We reflect on our reflective capabilities, which is like a hall of mirrors, but it's good to do. So this is what Tiffany and I came up with. It's in our chapter. I know there's a lot here, and it's probably not perfect, but it was our way of understanding this, again, this conceptual relationship between evaluative thinking, reflective practice, and phronesis, or practical wisdom. And we see it as a really iterative cycle. And this really builds off of a lot of work of Marta Hurteau as well on sort of how evaluators adjust and adapt when they confront difficult situations in practice. We also, Tiffany and I talked a lot about whether, doing reflective practice or doing evaluative thinking necessarily propels one towards doing good, like doing the ethically and morally correct thing. So, and this is again an open question in terms of evaluative thinking. Like, can you use evaluative thinking to create a better, weapon of mass destruction? One would hope not, but technically you could, unless you embed within evaluative thinking the practical wisdom aspect of doing what is good for society. But as we know, in society, sometimes people do harm in the name of doing good, allegedly or ostensibly. So we'll leave that to the ethicists. But as evaluators, especially as we're eschewing a simple, flat, technical rationality approach to evaluation and leaning into values and valuing, like Gates and Schwandt have reminded us to do, we have to ask, is this the right thing? And that requires practical wisdom. This is different than, for instance, a client pushing you to skew to drop off some outliers so that the regression line looks better, or to emphasize a particular point in the report, or have you put something in the report that you do not find. Hopefully the ethical evaluator walks away from that situation. But this is at a different level now. For instance, if you find that, or if you judge the program to be not working towards the common good, then what is your role as an evaluator? For instance, if the program is doing harm, perhaps your role as the evaluator is to use empirical analysis to point that out. But certainly it would take practical wisdom to navigate that situation. Also, on the last point on reflective practice, the wonderful Hazel Simonet has for a long time put forward this version of sort of the evaluator in the world as a reflective being. And I love how this sort of ties together professional development as well as a service-oriented approach to practicing evaluation. So there's great resources on that really, really ties into practical wisdom as well. So a couple times I've mentioned technical rationality, and that is a bit jargony. So if you're not familiar with that term, here it is. I don't think it was coined by Donald Schoen, but certainly made popular by him. So he described it as a positivist epistemology of professional knowledge and practice, in which professional activity consists of instrumental problem solving made rigorous by the application of scientific theory and technique. That word rigorous, we hear that a lot in evaluation, right? And we know what it means. It means different things to different funders or different institutions. But if you haven't come across that word too much and you are hearing it, you'll hear someone, for instance, say a rigorous impact evaluation. Well, that is code for a randomized controlled trial. Those words don't necessarily mean a randomized controlled trial, but they have been made to mean that. So it's interesting that back in '83, the word rigorous pops into Donald Schoen's definition of technical rationality and positivism. So it is the dominant epistemology of practice. So if you think about different professions, whatever they may be, teaching, healthcare, evaluation, there's a view that this view of practice has been the most powerfully influential in shaping how we think about professionalism and how we train professionals. Now, I will say that I think the Canadian Evaluation Society has done a great job of moving towards professionalization without sort of embedding technical rationality as the epistemology of their practice. And in fact, perhaps their secret sauce, their antidote, is that reflection is a key component of being a credentialed evaluator in Canada. So that's sort of the antidote to a professionalization approach that is overly reliant on technical rationality. Back here in the US, but also all around the world, the way that technical rationality really seeps into our world is through the quote unquote evidence, quote unquote based everything. It's evidence in quotes because whose evidence counts, or as Stewart and
Tom, we lost your sound right when you started talking about Stewart.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now, Tom.
Okay. Sorry. Oh yeah. Internet connection unstable. That's great. Hopefully it will persist. So yes, Stuart, Tina, and Mel wrote this book. It's now in its second edition. What counts as credible evidence? So when we say evidence-based education, evidence-based program, always ask evidence for whom? Whose evidence? What counts as evidence? And then I put based in quotes because especially if we are questioning the technical rationalistic approach to professional practice, practice is not based on evidence. It can be informed by evidence, but it's based on a whole host of other considerations. But one of the biggest debates in evaluation going back now over 20 years has been whether or not the randomized controlled trial is the gold standard. And the answer is no, it's not. But you still hear that sometimes. It's a persistent notion in some quarters. So when we are applying practical wisdom, we then can sort of resist this overconfidence in the application of evidence in institutionalized autopilot form, as Peter Dollar-Larsen has often lamented. And then here, Tiffany and I were very happy that we got to quote from my advisor in our chapter, Butch Wilson, who kind of, I think there's a quote from Schwandt later on in this presentation that's almost verbatim as this. They were talking about the same thing, but just from different disciplines. So approaching professional life through the lens of phronesis or practical wisdom, we see we can push back against the instrumentality of technical rationality and lean into praxis and practical reasoning to better understand the moral and political dimensions of our practice. And therefore, we have to put on the table our values, beliefs, and norms. And here also a foreshadowing post-normal evaluation, which suggests that we have to call into question our sense of certainty. And so that can be disquieting, but it's where we are. Also, similarly, in the writing from a European perspective, we see that if management, and you could replace management with evaluation there, because often, evaluation is used as a tool for management. And so if evaluation is perceived as context-free technical problem solving, emphasis will be placed on reducing uncertainty, or what's sometimes called complexity reduction in the systems thinking literature. But we ought to, they say, approach it as context-dependent practical action. So that's another component of practical wisdom. And then you see communicative process of dialogue. We harken back to what Tom Schwandt said about deliberation and argumentation and social learning. So I just mentioned post-normal evaluation. You might not have heard of that. It's not getting as much traction as I would have hoped, because I think it's a really important idea. But there's a paper from Tom Schwandt on it, and it was the topic of his talk in the 2018 European Evaluation Society Conference. And he asks, are modernity's blueprints for evaluation theory and practice exhausted? Evaluation really grew up on the foundation of notions of modernity and sort of progress, this teleological push towards some endpoint, and notions of even scientific paradigms that, certainly allow positivism to be so dominant, where the role of science is to know with as much absolute certainty as possible. And then the role of the professions, an educator, a social worker, what have you, is to take that knowledge and apply it to problems of practice. But Schwandt is asking us to consider how in evaluation we may question the assumptions of unpredictability, uncertainty, incompleteness, instability, and plurality in how we do evaluation. So this is why we need practical wisdom. I mentioned Martha Hurteau's work with colleagues on intuition, and this can be one that really, when you ask an average evaluator, or especially an evaluation student, they may initially assume that intuition ought not to have a very big role, if any, in evaluation, because it seems so subjective and untethered from empirical analysis and criteria-based value claims. And in fact, Martha and her colleagues interviewed young and emerging evaluators and seasoned evaluators, And the younger evaluators tend to say they do not use intuition in their practice, while the older seasoned evaluators tend to say that they do. Now, of course, you could never, or you should never, write an evaluation report based solely on intuition. That would not be evaluation. That would be something else. But they say when the evaluator is going through any host of steps of the process, they can draw on a reservoir of past experience to then inform the options that they're putting in front of themselves or their clients to make decisions about how to go forward. This is very much, I don't have a lot of time to go into it here, but the book I showed earlier from Ernie House, he actually spends quite a bit of time analyzing Kahneman's very popular thinking fast and slow approach. And House suggests to us that both system 1, or thinking fast, and thinking slow, system 2, are evaluative. And this sort of corroborates Martha Hurteau's work on the role of intuition. So that when you're walking down the street and you're making split second decisions about what to do, those are evaluative according to House. And when you're sitting down and working on a really complex analytical problem, you're also using evaluation, and that they both go together. And both are required in practical wisdom as well. This is another book that I highly recommend. If the only thing you take away is a couple good book recommendations, my job will be done. Here, Tom Schwandt really echoes what I learned from my advisor, Butch Wilson, about professional practice, but in this case, in evaluation. And as someone who teaches and trains on evaluation, like many of you, there are clear implications for how we are preparing the next generation of evaluators. So here, Schwandt's talking about the disposition and capacity to engage in moral, ethical, political reflection on our professional undertaking. And again, House talking about how we draw on intuition, make judgments, and act in ways that are appropriate. So just to close the circle on technical rationality, here we see Schwandt, again from that same book, essentially in discussing where technical rationality pops up in evaluation, showing that practice is the site where theoretical knowledge is applied. So I did my dissertation on evidence-based programs in youth development contexts, and one of my most shocking findings was that there was and this is probably still going on today, but this was, maybe 15 years ago, educational programs funded by the US government where the role of the educator was to literally open a box and deliver the educational training out of the box. There was a literal cardboard box. You talk about education in a box, they really made it real. And in that particular funding structure, because the education that was in that box had been shown, I'm loath to say proven, but had at least been shown via an RCT to be effective at changing one particular indicator of interest. This was a program focused on adolescent sexual health, and the main focus was on STD prevention and other issues. And so that was the variable of interest, and the RCT had found that it was effective. So the educator then, who could be, someone housed in a community center, someone who knows their context extremely well, then did not have the ability to make any adaptations to the program because that would violate the foundation of evidence. And so this is extreme technical rationality, almost like a caricature of technical rationality. But this is a real life case that was happening and is probably still happening. Interestingly, many of the educators in those contexts had appreciation for the curriculum that was given to them because they said they could hang their hat on it, but they also knew intuitively that they had to transgress and make small adaptations, even clandestinely, to make it even remotely relative and relevant to their learners. So they were in this tension of appreciating the evidence foundation and believing in it, but also realizing that as professional practitioners, they had to make some adaptations. And this is germane to evaluation, both because you may find yourself evaluating programs where that technical rationality is present, but then we can turn the mirror on ourselves, excuse me, and see how the technical rationality and the adherence to relatively rigid or rigorous approaches to doing evaluation are influencing not just our evaluands, but also our evaluation ourselves. So ultimately, we do need more reflection and action, which is what evaluators and practitioners do anyway, and on sort of ongoing experimentation. And here, not experimentation meaning an RCT, but meaning rapid cycles of probe, sense, respond, adaptive management, adaptive learning, which benefits from reflective practice. And then ultimately, if we remember Schwandt enjoining us to consider the moral and ethical implications, then we also bring back in the common good, and we try to reflect in action to advance the common good. So these are some thoughts that went into this book. I definitely didn't do it justice. I wish I could do a separate hour on each chapter, but I do encourage you to read each chapter if you get a chance. And with that, I would actually like to turn it over to you. I'm happy to answer your questions, but I thought of a few questions that I would love to hear your thoughts on. So, of course, I've shared many other people's thinking about what practical wisdom means to them, but I'd love to hear what it means to you. I'd love to hear how it shows up in your practice. Maybe before today, you did not articulate that practical wisdom was an important part of your practice, either as an evaluator or other areas of your practice. But now, and even if you hadn't named it as such, perhaps you were aware that it was happening. So now that we've named it, maybe can you identify places in your practice where it really shows up? Why, assuming you agree that it's important, why is it important for evaluation? And then lastly, for those of you who are learning evaluation or teaching or training on evaluation, what are the implications for this? The part of the book talks about, can it be taught? Well, it's some could say it can't be taught, but it can be learned. So how can we put people in situations where they can learn practical wisdom as they're learning to do evaluation and go out into the world and become evaluators? So here's my contact info. And with that, we've got a good 15 minutes or so for either your thoughts on these questions or my thoughts on the questions you have put in the chat in the meantime. So thanks so much. And I see Kim has a hand up. So Kim, go ahead. Good to see you.
Hi, Tom.
Hi.
Great to see you. I know you're not actually seeing me. I could put it on,
Good.
but I don't want to affect bandwidth too much.
Good to see your name.
Right. And great to see you. Yeah, and I really appreciate what you've been describing here. Am looking forward to reading this book. I have not read it yet. When it comes, I appreciated the definition of practical wisdom that were being shared. In my own practice, having coming in from adaptive management perspective, so programmatic strategy, a programmatic approach, but then through that and after that, spending the 20 years in evaluation, 20 plus. I agree. I liked what you said first about intuition, in that I would hope that earlier learners are relying more on what's shown to them, and then as we experience more, our intuition would grow. When it comes to practical wisdom, and I saw it in some of the descriptions, like the inquisitiveness piece, I felt like the approach one takes to evaluation becomes so important to using intuition and being able to use intuition, and therefore, in my view, having a greater sense of practical wisdom. You needed to have the foundations. You need to have more than the foundations too. You need to have a lot of practice, and you need to know to be innovative. You know, you need to have tried innovations and seen what's worked, seen what hasn't worked, know what's out there, like, you know, definitely stay up with things, but then also try those things, because you won't really know what works in a particular context until you've tried it. That might mean some sad, you know, failures along the way, and some things that are problematic. Always having ethics at the top, though. You know, you don't want to you don't want to increase the opportunity for harm along the way. So if anything, the evaluation fails, not something that has to do with the for lack of a better word, beneficiaries. When I wanted to bring up this point about humility, because I do feel like an approach where we know, even when we're in our own context that we know well, we don't know other people completely either. So I think humility is critical to any definition associated with practical wisdom and with believing, you know, yes, I would use my intuition. I don't rely on my intuition. I would say, you know, I then check and test it. But then also, it's so much of the work we do, and this is the point about the Western philosophy and stuff, are happening in areas that we do not know well. You know, we'll do international development work. We'll be from Maryland doing work in North Dakota. We don't know those contexts as well. I feel like one of the things that I hope has been learned among evaluators is the need for much more formative research before an evaluation is conducted. Because, you know, ideally that was done before the program was initiated. But if it wasn't, it should at least be done before the evaluation is done, because otherwise I think that practical wisdom could send you in the wrong direction and not the right direction.
Yeah, great points, Kim. Thanks a lot. And I love that you mentioned humility. You know, cultural humility is one of the foundations of culturally responsive evaluation. And then also, Tiffany and I have also looked into intellectual humility, which I was not as familiar with, but has a whole vast literature. And we're like, oh, we need this to come into the field of evaluation much more. So that's a area. If there's anyone out there looking for a dissertation topic, you may just have found one: intellectual humility in evaluation. And yeah, I tell my students all the time that, you know, because as you know, I do so-called international development, and which sometimes involves evaluation, and this vast chasm of my sort of where I come from and where I am, and is so potentially problematic. But then at the same time, I mean, I could walk down the street and be in a context that I also don't understand because of who I'm, you know, I barely understand myself. I don't think I do understand myself. So how can I understand the other? And who is the other? So when you were talking about that dynamic and the need for humility, it also drove home to me. So everything in evaluation that talks about context and culture, so from Stafford Hood, Jennifer Green, et cetera, and, you know, context has been the theme of the AEA conference at least once since I've been going. It could probably be the theme every other year, and we would still not overdo it. The importance of context in evaluation. But it also drives home to me the importance of teams. Like, you hear about the wisdom of teams. So whether it's about program planning and program design or about evaluation, you know, given that we can never know with any certainty, even you know, if we have a beautiful logic model, a beautiful survey, the importance of teams and also the importance of collaborative approaches. I've long been a fan of the whole panoply of participatory, collaborative, empowerment evaluation. And that's why I love ECB, because then people who know their context better, know their program better, are the ones doing the evaluation. And you're much more likely to get it right than a 1 week field visit where you parachute in and run away and write a report. So yeah, absolutely. So there's more to be done on humility, cultural humility and intellectual humility.
We have a question in the room, Tom. Ernest?
Thank you, Tom. I mean, I appreciate the insight you've given us. In my opinion, I think practical wisdom make more sense to me in connection to reflective practice and evaluative thinking that you mentioned. You talked of these three concepts, and I think practical wisdom cannot stand alone, in my opinion. It doesn't make more sense to me until it is connected to being reflective in our practice and then thinking evaluatively. And that is why I think that I also side with the people that believe that I love teaching, so I love teaching evaluation. People that believe that practical wisdom cannot be taught. Maybe we can learn, we can teach it, because we need to reflect and we need to be thinking, and it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to teach reflection and all these stuff. And also, you made mention of the fact that in practical wisdom, we are kind of transitioning from I already hear technical rationality to kind of practice. It's like, okay, it just you pushed me to the wall when I heard that statement. I don't know, but I just wanted you to just clarify that a bit. I know practical wisdom comes with these two things I think should be in place, because without that, then practical wisdom will be hard to grasp, in my opinion.
Yeah, thanks, Ernest. And yeah, I do think that practical wisdom is kind of a higher order or bigger tent, and that evaluative thinking and reflective practice are necessary to get there. And yeah, technical rationality. So I did not go into Aristotle very, very much, but going back to that book where I first learned about phronesis, Fluberg, some people have said he misunderstands Aristotle, but there's a million pages written analyzing Aristotle's intellectual virtues. But they largely, so at Fluberg at least, focused on phronesis, which is practical wisdom, and then on techne, which is technical know-how, so more connected to technical rationality, and then episteme, which is like knowledge, almost for knowledge's sake. I don't know. Tiffany, correct me if I'm wrong. And so none of those is unimportant. They're all important. And so technique, if you have an engineer designing a bridge, you want them to know the right equations to use to have the bridge stand up when you're driving over it. Is there a role for practical wisdom in bridge building? Well, circling back to culturally responsiveness and cultural humility, you could say, you have to expand your bounds of understanding bridge building and say, is building this bridge going to further exacerbate inequalities amongst the communities that are near the bridge? That there's some people laugh at the notion that highways are racist, but it's an objective fact that the way highways have been built in the United States have had racist outcomes. So then the highways are racist. So we do need practical wisdom to try to advance the common good, even when we're building infrastructure, let alone building an education program. So yeah, technical rationality is not to say that technique or technical know-how is not important. To get back to Kim's point, we do want to learn how to make good surveys and how to make a good logic model. Those are all important pieces of knowledge for an evaluator. But we also want the evaluator to be able to make judgments in situ, in the moment, reflecting on their intuition. And actually, one thing I forgot to say, but I think it's pertinent to your point too, Ernest, is, you know, for students of evaluation or for young and emerging evaluators who may feel more hesitant to use their own intuition because they don't feel as solid in the technique of evaluation, one place where I have seen young and emerging evaluators bring intuition to the table is, you know, from other contexts. So they understand their context, they have intuition about it, and then they bring that into the evaluation situation. And I think more and more young and emerging evaluators and evaluation students are doing that, including, you know, questioning some of the foundational assumptions of evaluation. And that's good. That's how progress happens.
Yeah, my name is John. I'm in the room here. To answer your first two questions, I wanted to pick from Scriven's ethics, where he spoke about ethics for, areas in small groups and also ethics based on society. So for the first answer, what I want to say is that when he spoke about the ethics for evaluators, he was trying to make reference to how evaluators can ensure stakeholders are respected or treated with dignity. So I think for the practical wisdom, what it means to we, the evaluators, is how to ensure stakeholders or the clients we deal with are treated with dignity and respect. Back to the second question, what does practical wisdom show up? How does that show up in our practice? I think it shows how we empower the stakeholders, because that was what Scriven was trying to say, that ethics plays a role in how we engage with stakeholders and how we empower them. So I think the second question is kind of line to those areas where Scriven is talking about how we treat stakeholders. So that is my point.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. And Nikki, I see you've got your hand up, and I think you maybe get the final word, which is how it should be.
Katawatalomwa. That's how we say love you, happy Valentine's Day in the Lenape language. Just wanted, I think this is a super important conversation that needs much more discussion and much more study in this area. Especially, I encourage multidisciplinary, look across the disciplines, not the normal places, for how we talk about ethics and practical wisdom. Wisdom, not more information, is something that is carried over through time and solves real problems and has real relevance. So as an Indigenous person, you know, I try to live wise like the elders that I'm going to take out to Valentine's Day lunch soon here. I really am interested in working on, appreciate you talking about what I would call first voice. There's a lot more ethnographic refusal. So those of us, and I really appreciate, Tom, you bringing up the positionality statement. As a new editor for the culture ethics and values section of AJE, apologies, Aisha Boyce, myself, and Gregory Phillips are part of that. It's Gregory is a gay man, Aisha is a Black woman, Nikki's a Native woman or mixed race, and we're other things too. But I'm just saying that we are really looking at this. What makes you the authority to speak if you're not first voice? What is your positionality? You know, I think there's a lot of ethics and wisdom tied up in that, because if people like Tom, our ally, our brother, doesn't speak up about positionality, he's very aware of this, we just continue to perpetuate that colonial voice in the way we teach and in the way we write. So I really appreciate what you're bringing about, Tom, with this book. It's an amazing book. Yes, we would have loved to be part of it, but there's a bigger plan, and I believe in that bigger plan. But it's always going to include you, my friend.
Amen. Thank you.
Tiffany, I see you. Lots of yous.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And Tom, thank you for your presentation. I did pop a link into the chat if anybody wants to join our Eval Cafe mailing list or see what's coming up for the spring. I know Tom said he's already registered, so hopefully you can join us again. And thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.